The situation for emerging markets is more difficult today. Let's go back now to the United States, Europe and Japan. And then, of course, we'll speak also about Russia. The US economic recovery is still strong, but there are risks. If the world economy were to surprise on the downside, and if the dollar were to continue to appreciate, stronger dollar and weaker global growth implies that even US economic activity could slow down through a weakening of US net exports that will be driven by the strong dollar and weakness in the global economic growth. That might lead the Fed to start increasing zero policy rate later and more slowly. The Fed had said we may start raising rates in the middle of next year, but the chances are that they're going to start only in the third quarter, maybe even the fourth quarter, if global growth surprises on the downside and if the dollar keeps on appreciating. What about the Eurozone? In the Eurozone, as I pointed out, the latest data suggests near deflation and near recession. The fundamental problems of the Eurozone will not be resolved. Problem of potential growth, given the lack of structural reform, problems of competitiveness, problems of credit crunch and slow creation of credit. You need, in addition to structural reform, to boost aggregate demand in the Eurozone. That requires quantitative easing by the ECB, it requires fiscal stimulus by Germany, and less fiscal austerity in the periphery. I think the ECB is going to get to quantitative easing by early next year, too little too late. They should have done it now. But on the fiscal side, Germany is against a fiscal stimulus that will be necessary for Germany and the rest of the Eurozone, and therefore the fiscal policy is not going to help the recovery of the Eurozone. So the Eurozone is going to surprise on the downside in terms of economic growth and inflation next year. In Japan, as I pointed out, the slow movement towards structural reform implies that growth potential is not rising, and raising the consumption tax too soon has killed economic recovery. And therefore, the only game in town is monetary policy right now, more easing by the Bank of Japan and postponing the second round of the fiscal consolidation. But the decision by the Bank of Japan to ease monetary policy and weaken the yen are going to lead now to a new round of currency wars. Why do I speak about a new round of currency wars? The yen is weakening, and that yen depreciation is leading to other currency in Asia, in Europe, and even relative to the dollar to appreciate relative to the yen, and it's a competitiveness game. And it's a zero-sum game, of course, because if my currency is weaker, somebody else has to be stronger. If my growth is better and my net exports are better, somebody else's has to be worse. The sum of all trade balances in the world is equal to zero. We don't trade with the moon or Mars, and therefore it's a competitive war, it's a currency war that implies stealing demand from others, better than neighbor policies, and exporting your deflation to other parts of the world. Guess what? Now that the yen has weakened, central banks from Korea to Thailand to Taiwan are easing monetary policy to weaken their currencies, to prevent their currency from appreciating relative to the yen. I was recently even in China, where the Chinese are saying, well, our currency is strengthening relative to the yen, relative to the euro, maybe we should let our currency now depreciate relative to US dollar because we're going to lose competitiveness. And of course, the actions of the Bank of Japan are also leading to movements in monetary policy in Europe. As I pointed out, the biggest victim of a yen weakness is not Korea or China, it's Germany and the Eurozone, because they compete for same export markets of high value-added exporters of machinery, tech goods, and so on. Therefore, the strengthening of the euro relative to the yen is going to lead the European Central Bank to do quantitative easing to prevent excessive strengthening of the euro relative to the yen. The Swiss National Bank will have to prevent its currency from appreciating. The Swedish Riksbank, Norges Bank in Norway, some of the central banks in Central Europe that are tied to the euro might ease monetary policy. So if everybody is trying to weaken their currency following what the BOJ has done, which currency is going to keep on appreciating? Like this year, is going to be the US dollar. The US dollar is going to strengthen further relative to the yen, relative to the euro, relative to commodity currencies like the Canadian dollar, the Australian dollar, and other commodity currencies from Russia to Nigeria to Venezuela to other countries that are commodity exporters. And of course, the value of the dollar is going to keep on appreciating against the currencies of emerging markets that have macro fragility, the fragile five, for example, and other fragile emerging markets. Now, for a while, the US can live with a stronger dollar because domestic demand, consumption, capital spending, residential is strong enough that even if the net exports of the US worsen, US economic growth is not going to slow down very much. But if the dollar were to appreciate too much, and if therefore the rest of the world is weaker in terms of growth, you cannot rule out that the Fed is going to become worried about the US dollar, about the pressure of stronger dollar on too low inflation, and also on the net export worsening, weakening US economic growth. If that were to happen, the Fed is going to start raising rates later and more slowly than otherwise to prevent too much of a strong dollar appreciation. Now, in this global context, of course, another important event is occurring is the fall of commodity prices, and especially the very sharp fall in oil prices that has occurred in the last few months. And of course, lower oil prices benefit those countries that are net oil importers, like the United States, like Europe, like Japan, like Turkey, like China, like India, and other emerging markets that are oil and energy importers, but they are very negative, of course, for economic growth and financial conditions in those emerging markets that are oil and energy exporters, starting with Russia, starting with the Gulf economies, going to Libya, going to Venezuela, Nigeria, and many other oil exporters and commodity exporters. So it's on a redistribution, redistributes income from exporters to importers. Now, the net impact on the global economy of a fall in oil prices, however, is positive, even if there are those who are losers and there are those who are gainers. An increase in the supply of oil and a fall in oil prices is like a positive supply shock for the global economy. It increases demand, consumption, and investment in consumer countries more than it reduces consumption and investment in the oil exporting countries, and therefore on net it increases global demand, on net it increases global growth, on net it reduces global inflation, and therefore with more growth and lower inflation, central banks in advanced economies can ease more when they need to ease more, like Japan and the Eurozone, to avoid deflation, or they can delay monetary tightening like the United States and the United Kingdom. So that later monetary tightening or additional monetary easing becomes an additional positive for global growth and for global risky assets like global equities, like housing, like credit. But as I pointed out, of course, on net is good for the global economy, but is very damaging of economic growth in those countries that are oil exporters. But on net, it is a positive. So, what's going to be happening in this global economy? As I pointed out, some advanced economies improve, some of them are lagging. US, UK on one side, Eurozone and Japan on the other side. In emerging markets, many of them, unfortunately, are slowing down, starting with China, but some of them that are more geared to growth of the US will improve. In Latin America, Mexico and Colombia are strengthened by US, while Chile, Peru, and Brazil are hurt by China and falling commodity prices. Same thing in Asia. Korea is linked to the US cycle, but other countries are linked through commodity and trade links more to China. So we cannot generalize about this global economy. Now let me say something about Russia. And of course, I'm not going to make any value judgment about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Reality, however, is that this conflict, whoever may get blamed for it, is leading to sanctions and counter-sanctions. And this sanction and counter-sanction hurt both Europe and Russia. I would say that currently they're hurting more Russia and the Russian economy, but they're certainly having also an impact on Germany and the Eurozone. And one of the reasons why economic activity and sentiment in the Eurozone is weakening is because exports to Russia are falling, and investors, firms are doing capital spending in Germany, in Europe, in Eastern Europe, are concerned about the volatility, about the exacerbation of the conflict, and therefore they're more cautious in their capital spending. In Russia, of course, the combination of sanctions and the sharp fall in oil prices is leading to a sharp economic slowdown. This year, growth could be close to zero, slightly positive, slightly negative. Next year, growth is going to be close to zero. Maybe positive, maybe negative. Of course, whether it's going to be positive or negative depends on whether the sanctions escalate and whether oil prices are going to fall further. If there are more sanctions and oil prices are lower, then you could have an outright recession. And economic policy makers in Russia, from the finance minister, the economic minister, to the central bank governor, have already pointed out that that's going to be the case. Of course, there has been this sharp fall in the value of the ruble. The fall in the value of the ruble is a negative because it increases inflation and it forces the central bank to increase interest rates to avoid the free fall of the currency. For a while, the central bank tried to defend the currency by selling reserves, but after losing about $70 billion of reserves, trying to slow down or to finance the capital flight, decided that it's better to save those reserves for bad times, and therefore now there's closer to a free float. The currency will keep on falling if sanctions continue and become worse, and if the oil price fall further. Is inflationary, this depreciation of the currency. It has, however, some beneficial effect. The import bans on imports of food from Europe towards and the depreciation of the ruble are leading now to import substitution. Foreign goods are too expensive, therefore domestic manufacturing of domestic goods is going to improve. That improvement of essentially manufacturing, together with the fall of imports from the rest of the world, is going to lead to some recovery of the manufacturing sector in Russia. Therefore, the impact of the sanctions and the fall in oil prices is going to be absorbed in part, but only in part, by the weakening of the ruble. The weakening of the ruble also implies that the value in ruble of the exports of oil are larger. That helps to finance the budget deficit of Russia, and Russia has been reasonably conservative in its budget policy so far, and therefore there is room for some fiscal expansion. Of course, there is a fragility of those banks, financial institutions, and corporates that are, one, subject to sanction, two, they have a lot of foreign currency denominated liability, and three, the fall in the value of the euro is hurting them because the real value of those liabilities is rising, and their access to capital market is now restricted by sanctions. About 50 billion plus of debt of the financial system has to be rolled over by the end of the year. My view is that these financial institutions will have access to the dollar and euro liquidity of the central bank, and therefore the risk of a real debt crisis for those banks and those large corporates is limited. But of course, the reserves of the central bank are in limited supply. If the ruble were to go into a free fall, of course the pressure could become worse. The good news is that households in Russia that have had the real value in foreign currency of their ruble deposit sharply fallen, 40%, given depreciation, they've not run out of their banks to try to convert the rubles into US dollar or euros, and therefore the pressure on the currency has remained limited. If, however, economic and financial conditions were to worsen, one could not rule out a run out of ruble into foreign currency by households, and that will put additional pressure downward on the value of the ruble that could become, at some point, destabilizing. So to conclude, the global economy is complicated. Some of the engines are working, others are not working. There are a number of geopolitical risks. Monetary easing is supporting risky assets, but there are economic fragilities and currency wars of trying to depreciate to regain competitiveness become, in part, a zero-sum game. And therefore, next year is going to be a year that for the global economy is still slightly better than this year, slightly better, but there are downside risks. The main ones are China surprising on the downside, 2, Eurozone surprising on the downside, 3, Japan still being very mediocre, and geopolitical fragilities leading to bout of financial contagion, together with economic and financial fragilities in some emerging markets. So it is a mixed picture for the global economy and financial markets looking ahead. Maybe I'll stop here and I'll be happy to take questions.
Такое вот емкое выступление. Я убежден, что вопросы назрели. Вот уже первый желающий. Я передам вам. Есть микрофон?
Работает? Да. Что нужно сделать?
Можешь воспользоваться.
Да нет, у меня зеленый. Александр Егоров, Телетрейд. Насколько я знаю, вы очень мало рассматривали исторических периодов, которые благоприятны для экономического развития и для фондовых рынков в частности. Весной 2013 года вы предрекали крах на фондовом рынке, на американском фондовом рынке в течение года или 2. Заканчивается 2014 год. Америка, с вашей точки зрения, сейчас в лидерах мирового восстановления. Американский фондовый рынок регулярно обновляет исторические максимумы. Изменились ли ваши взгляды на перспективы рынка? И если он все-таки рухнет, то теперь уже когда? Спасибо.
Well, first of all, I was bearish about the US economy and the stock market in 2006 and 2007 when I saw the looming housing bust and the financial crisis occurring. Since then, actually, my view has been that the recovery, however gradual, of US and global growth will be associated with a recovery of equity markets, and that recovery of equity markets has occurred. And me and my firm do expect that global and US equity next year are going to still have positive return. Single digits, not double digits. So, you know, since US equity prices this year have risen further versus a lot last year, we expect that maybe US equity market can go up only 5% next year, and globally maybe 5 to 7%. I did not expect a crash of the US stock market last year. I pointed out that valuations were excessive, and if shocks were to occur, corrections could occur. And guess what? In August through October of this year, there was concerns in the market that led to a rise in volatility and almost a 10% correction. Why? We had bad economic news out of Germany and Eurozone, out of Japan, even a growth scare in the United States. And now the IMF spoke about the new mediocre in global growth, including China and emerging markets. Market got nervous and they corrected. And when did they recover? They did not recover because economic fundamentals have improved. They recover because the Fed first said, well, if the world is so bad, maybe we're going to start raising rates later and more slowly. then the Bank of Japan surprised the markets by doing quantitative easing additionally, and now the ECB says, I'm going to increase my balance sheet by $1 trillion, and I'm going to then maybe go into formal quantitative easing, and other central banks are saying, hey, if the yen and the euro weaken, I'm also going to ease monetary policy. So the strengthening of many equity markets and the recovery is not driven by stronger economic fundamentals, with the exception of the United States and UK. It's driven by the effects of liquidity on asset prices, in spite of real growth fundamental still being very fragile in Europe, in Japan, in China, and many emerging markets. So the question is, open one is, can liquidity alone increase asset prices, starting with US and global equity, if the global economic recovery doesn't recover strong enough? In the short run, the effects of liquidity on levitating asset prices dominate. Over the medium term, if growth were to surprise on the downside, in spite of the easier monetary policy, at some point, further correction in equity markets in the country where have still negative surprises could occur, even if monetary and fiscal policy becomes looser.
Что ж, я думаю, второй вопрос, самое удобное время. Да, конечно.
Добрый день, Денис Галвалес, трейдер. У меня два вопроса к вам. Мистер Рубини, как вы можете охарактеризовать текущее состояние мировой экономики? Мы сейчас в фазе спада или все-таки замедления роста еще? И второй вопрос о состоянии микроэкономики в Соединенных Штатах Америки. Как ваш взгляд?
Well, you know, the global economy right now is in a state of growth. First of all, we're not in a recession. And when you are in economic growth, there are two stages. One in which the growth accelerates, and one growth decelerates, and there is a slowdown in spite of positive growth. My view of it is in the aggregate, the global economy right now is in a stage of a slowdown, because while there is acceleration of growth in the United States and in the United Kingdom, in the rest of the world instead, growth is barely positive like the Eurozone or Japan, and there is sluggish growth. So there has been deceleration of growth, not acceleration in other advanced economies, and therefore we are in a deceleration stage. And if I look at the emerging markets, in most emerging markets, there is currently a deceleration of growth. Certainly in China, certainly in Russia and other oil exporters, certainly in the other fragile five, last year and this year for the fragile five, Russia, Brazil, Turkey, India, Indonesia, there was an economic slowdown that continued this year. Next year, some of these economies are going to be maybe growing slightly faster. India is going to grow slightly faster. Brazil is going to grow slightly faster. Indonesia is going to grow slightly faster. And maybe Turkey slightly faster. I'm not sure about South Africa. I'm not sure about Russia. I'm not sure about those emerging markets that have a variety of fragilities, starting, of course, now with the oil exporters. So, if I had to characterize the global economic growth, I would say positive, but not accelerating. I would say positive, but slow down, deceleration, and I would also agree with the IMF characterization of global growth as being the new mediocre. There are structural problems in advanced economies and emerging markets, but structural reform that would boost potential and natural growth are occurring too slowly, because the political economy of reform is that they have short-term costs, even if they have medium-term benefits. Now, from a microeconomic point of view, the US economy, I would say, is positive in the sense that the private sector is dynamic. there is a lot of innovation. If you think about the industries of the futures, ET, energy technologies, traditional fossil fuels and non-traditional like shale gas and oil, BT, biotechnology, biomedical research, gene therapy, IT, information technologies, Web 2.0, 3.0, social media, big data, Internet of Things, MT, manufacturing technologies, robotic, automation, nanotechnology, DT, defense technology. Unfortunately, in a world of geopolitical tensions, there will be military spending and use of new technologies to advance weapon systems like drones and others. In all of these 5 industries of the future, the US is doing well in all 5 of them. In some of these 5 of them, Europe is doing well, or Japan, or China, or some emerging market, but there's only one economy you could say that is at the cusp of innovation in all of these 5 new technologies and industries of the future. So the positive of the United States is that bottom up, from a micro point of view, actually the US system is dynamic, entrepreneurial, huge amount of innovation from Silicon Valley and other parts of the world. The shale gas and oil revolution is going to lead to energy-intensive sector of US to grow faster, some reshoring of manufacturing. Of course, part of the problem is that this innovation is capital-intensive, labor-saving. So we'll create a lot of output, a lot of profits, a lot of jobs for skilled workers, but not many jobs for unskilled or semi-skilled, blue-collar and white-collar. And the rise of inequality, therefore, becomes a problem. The problem of the US is the dysfunctional political system, gridlock in Congress because you have divided government. Even the US has to do structural reform to increase potential growth. Otherwise, potential growth of the US might be falling. But the disagreement between Democrats and Republicans, between White House and Congress, implies we're not going to do immigration reform. We're not going to do energy reform. We're not going to reform our system of corporate taxation. We'll have disagreements on the budget, on the debt. We're not going to reform our social pension system and health care. We're not going to have more rational regulation policy or energy policy. We're not going to have an infrastructure bank that needed to do more infrastructure spending. So the dysfunctionality of the political system is going to be a negative for economic growth, even if the private sector is strong and dynamic. So that's the kind of thing. Top down, the political system is going to imply some weakness for the strength, micro, bottom up of the private sector.
У нас есть еще один вопрос от молодого эксперта.
Здравствуйте, господин Рубини, Подгубский Михаил, аналитик группы компании Trade. Вопрос мой в следующем. В последние несколько лет ведущие центральные банки существенно нарастили свои балансы. Различные центральные банки проводят своеобразные программы выкупа активов. Федеральная резервная система существенно расширила баланс. Свою программу выкупа активов проводит Банк Англии. Банк Японии с временем все больше и больше наращивает объем программ выкупа активов. И, скорее всего, велика вероятность того, что в ближайшем будущем Европейский центральный банк также ведет стимулирующие меры, масштабную программу стимулирования. В результате всего этого, скорее всего, образуется огромная гора госдолга. И, соответственно, на ваш взгляд, является ли риском возможный такой сценарий, что в случае прекращения стимулирования ведущими центральными банками процентные ставки, в принципе, по всему миру существенно возрастут, что является, естественно, существенным фактором риска для банковской системы в целом. Как вы рассматриваете такой сценарий? Как вообще ведущие центральные банки будут пытаться нивелировать эту проблему?
Well, the reason why there has been unconventional monetary policy from the Fed to the Bank of England, to the ECB, to the Bank of Japan, to other major central banks, has been that the recovery of growth in advanced economies after the financial crisis was anemic. For a while there was fiscal stimulus, but then given rising deficit and debt, you needed to do fiscal consolidation. And that fiscal consolidation was drag on economic growth. and the third arrow of structural reform in advanced economies occurred too slowly, and that did not boost therefore economic growth. So with lack of structural reform and a fiscal drag, the only game in town to try to boost asset prices, reduce cost of borrowing for the government and the private sector, to try to avoid deflation was monetary easing, and that's why you had unconventional monetary policy, zero interest rate policy, QE, quantitative easing, CE, credit easing, FG, forward guidance. Those are all esoteric and unconventional, but they were necessary because if we had not done it, the global recession would have become a global depression, and we would have had a double dip or a triple dip of growth in the global economy. So we avoided actually a more severe outcome by doing that monetary easing. Now, if you think about this monetary easing, interest rates are not going up, they're going down in spite of this monetary easing because there's no inflation in the global economy. And given the slack in goods market, in labor market, given the slack in housing, the excess capacity, there is no inflation in advanced economies. Central bank is struggling to achieve a 2% inflation. So the money printing is not inflationary. It doesn't lead to higher interest rates. It leads to lower interest rates that you need for that recovery. Additionally, if you think about this quantitative easing, buying sovereign bonds, what is it? Effectively, it represents a monetization of public debt. A lot of the public debt rose because there was budget deficit. The central bank buying bonds and giving currency, effectively it converts that debt into cash that pays zero interest rates. So that eases the burden of fiscal policy, and it makes the likelihood of a fiscal and debt crisis less likely because effectively a good chunk of the public debt is monetized. Now, central bank would not tell you that we are monetizing the debt of the government because they claim they're independent, but the reality is effectively is that that purchase of bonds is a form of debt monetization. So the risk of a debt crisis of the government is reduced because you are essentially reducing the interest rate on the government debt and you're monetizing some of that public debt. Now, some people worry that all this monetization is going to eventually lead to inflation, but there is no inflation. There's no inflation because there is slack in labor market, goods market, excess capacity, and housing, because you're monetizing exactly because inflation is falling, and with commodity and oil prices falling, the risk is not inflation, the risk is disinflation or outright deflation. And while we're printing money, all that increase in credit, increase in liquidity, has not led to an increase in the credit to the real economy. Credit remains low because all this extra liquidity has been hoarded by the banking system in the form of excess reserves. Velocity of money has collapsed, and if anything, this liquidity is not going into goods inflation, is leading to asset inflation or inflation. It's boosting equity market, housing market, credit, the price of government bonds. But that is an objective of central bank. If they have housing and equity going higher, that's going to boost wealth, it's going to stimulate the economy. If the cost of credit for the private and public sector is reduced, that's going to lead to some economic recovery. Now, of course, the risk is that all this liquidity going into asset prices is leading to asset reflation that eventually can become asset inflation, asset frothiness, and asset and credit bubble. And if eventually all this liquidity were to lead to asset and credit bubble, you can have another 2 years of credit and asset bubbles, but eventually that boom and the bubble could lead, like in 2006, 7, and 8, to a bust and a crash. However, that bust and a crash is not yet here. It may occur over time if all this liquidity leads to that situation of asset bubble. So I don't worry about goods inflation, I worry about asset inflation and asset bubble. There is a risk to the global economy and financial market is not of goods inflation, but of asset bubble and inflation. But even that risk is maybe 2 years down the line because we are only in the early stages of releveraging of credit, releveraging of equity market, releveraging of the economy, of the financial system, of the corporate sector, and of credit market. We're going in the direction of releveraging, but we're still in the early stages of it. But so if I see a risk is essentially that all this liquidity creates credit in an asset bubble and a boom that eventually goes into a bust and a crash a couple of years down the line. That certainly is a risk that you have to worry down the line in the medium term about the global economy, but not goods inflation. In most advanced economies, you'll have to avoid deflation. Of course, in some emerging markets, where inflation was already high because of loose monetary and fiscal policy and credit policy, and where now their currency are depreciating, inflation is rising. Like Russia, like the rest of the fragile five, like the country where currency is weakening and falling currency and rising prices can lead to a spiral of depreciation and inflation. Whether that's going to occur depends in part on whether central banks in this country, starting with the one in Russia, are going to tighten enough monetary policy to avoid the free fall of the currency that's going to be inflation. So in many emerging markets, of course, the risk is of rising inflation, but this is not a problem in most advanced economies. Most advanced economies will have to worry about deflation and disinflation, especially as oil and commodity prices are falling further.
Член компании «Трейд». Хотел бы услышать вашу точку зрения на рынке драгоценных металлов.
My view of the precious metal, especially gold, is bearish. Of course, gold prices for a number of years were rising. They reached a peak of $1,900 per ounce in September of a couple of years ago. Since then, they've fallen $1,200. And I would not be surprised if gold prices in the next 12 months could fall further towards $1,100, if not $1,000. Why I think so? Gold was rising very sharply when there was massive amounts of monetization by the Fed, and but now QE is over. Gold was going high when real interest rates in advanced economies were negative and becoming more negative, but now that the Fed is done with quantitative easing and is going to start rising rates, however slowly, real rates are going to go higher. That's a negative for commodities, including precious metals. Gold rises because it's a hedge against inflation. But there is no inflation in the US, in Europe, in Japan, in Switzerland, in advanced economies. And therefore, that hedge, inflation hedge demand for gold is not there. Gold goes higher when there is a risk of a global financial crisis. But while the global economy is not great, there is not a global financial crisis, and the risk of a global financial crisis or even of a sovereign debt crisis in the Eurozone today is limited, and therefore gold is downward. Gold gives you only a capital gain, doesn't give you any income. The way housing, rental gives you an income, equities, dividends give you an income, bonds give you an income. So it's only a capital gain story, and as you have a recovery of the global economy, other assets like equity, like housing, like credit, provide you not only a capital gain, but they provide you also an income. And therefore, in relative terms, other assets give you a higher expected return than gold. Finally, there is a relation between the dollar price of commodities, including precious metal, and the value of the dollar. When the dollar is weaker, the dollar price of commodity goes up. When the dollar is stronger, the dollar price of commodity, including precious metal, goes down. And guess what? Today, we have dollar strengthening, pushing down the dollar price of commodities, including gold. So if you look at all of the fundamentals of gold, I would suggest that there's been a fundamental reason why gold prices have fallen from 1900 to 1200, and those fundamental factors are going to lead to slightly lower, I don't expect a collapse, slightly lower gold prices. Now, of course, every time there is some major geopolitical risk, investors might become nervous and they may go into safe assets like US treasuries or Swiss francs or maybe a little bit of gold. Of course, demand of gold by major central banks like those in Russia and India or private sector may also affect gold demand. But central banks are becoming more cautious in the holding of gold, and even India has imposed a number of restrictions on private purchases of gold by its own household and the private sector. So there will be movements upward and downward in gold prices, and some tail risks that affect, of course, gold may lead to some increase. But I would say, overall, I think that gold prices are more likely to go lower than they are likely to go higher, even if most of the adjustment in gold prices has already occurred, and therefore the downside to gold right now is limited because most of the adjustment, a 40% fall from the peak, has already occurred. I would say that the same story in terms of fundamentals holds for other precious metals. Other precious metals like silver or platinum have also an industrial use. It's not just a store of value, and therefore what happens to them depends also on the strength of the global economic recovery and the industrial manufacturing uses of silver and platinum. And of course there are also idiosyncratic factors, strikes in South Africa have led from time to time to shocks to the supply of platinum. So there are also micro-related demand and supply factors that can affect those precious metals. But I would say the entire precious metal group is on a downside risk rather than an overall upside risk.
Здравствуйте, господин Рубини. Аналитик исследовательского центра «Не экономика» Анна Кузьмина. Вот мы все знаем, что на рынке Китая надулся уже достаточно большой пузырь недвижимости. И насколько вы оцениваете риск схлопывания этого пузыря в ближайшее время и его влияние на всю китайскую экономику?
As you point out, everybody realizes, and we've been writing extensively for a number of years, that there has been a huge housing and commercial real estate bubble. It's not just housing, but also many parts of commercial real estate have led to excess capacity. Housing as a share of GDP today in China is 12%. It's huge. In the US historically it was 3%. It went at the peak of the bubble to 6%. Now it's down to less than 3. Fair enough, China, because of urbanization, needs more housing than the US, but no country can do residential investment to the order of 12% of GDP without having a massive excess of housing and commercial real estate. And it's not just investment in real estate. In China, fixed investment in new capital is 50% of GDP. It is housing, commercial real estate, infrastructure, and excess capacity in the manufacturing and the industrial sector, and therefore investment as a share of GDP will have to fall from 50 to a much lower level. It used to be 40% of GDP in 2006, now it's closer to 50. Investment will fall regardless of, in housing and otherwise. So if the Chinese do the reform to increase consumption as a share of GDP, there will be a slowdown of growth, but there will be a softer landing or a bumpy landing. I do worry, however, the excesses in real estate are so much that by next year you'll have a sharp contraction in residential investment. There's also a credit crunch in the housing and real estate market. Now, the authorities are aware of it. They're worried of a collapse of housing, a collapse of prices. So while they've not done a generalized monetary and credit easing, they're doing now targeted easing of credit to try to support housing in some towns and some provinces, or to try to provide more social financing for social housing. So they're going to try to prevent the full bust of the housing and real estate sector, but their ability to manage that housing and real estate contraction is going to be limited, and therefore a sharp contraction of quantity and prices is going to occur in China. You're going to just avoid the full bust, and that's the best you can do in China right now. But certainly, given the importance of housing in the economy, and not just housing, infrastructure also is going to contract. Fixed investment in the capital stock of the corporate and state-owned enterprise is going to contract. That's why I expect the Chinese growth is going to be closer to 5% in 2006 than to 7%. It's not the real hard landing that will occur if the Chinese growth would collapse to 3%. Some people worry about the real hard landing, but even 5% growth is going to have damaging effect on China, on industrial metals, on commodities, on Chinese equities, on Asian equities, and for exporters of machinery and of raw materials of every form to China. And we do expect that we have this below consensus view on Chinese growth, of a rough or a bumpy landing. And China being the second largest economy in the world, what happens in China is not going to hurt only China, it's also going to have a big impact on emerging markets, on Asia, on advanced economies exporting to China, and on commodity exporters all over the world. So China has systemic effects on the global economy. Our views are significantly below consensus, short of a hard landing about China.
Господин Рубини, позволю себе тоже задать вопрос. Евгений Филиппов, компания Teletrade. Вопрос следующий. На текущий момент американский рынок акций от месяца к месяцу демонстрирует рекорд за рекордом. Вот такой вопрос. Не кажется ли вам, что на этом рынке мы можем наблюдать очередной пузырь, продолжая тему пузырей? И если ожидать коррекцию на американском рынке, то по вашим прогнозам, когда мы можем это увидеть и до каких уровней будет эта коррекция, если взять за основу, ну, предположим, индекс S&P 500?
Certainly the level of the equity market in the United States is high and rising. The question is if valuations are excessive or not. If you look at the price to earning ratio for S&P 500 from the United States, that price to earning ratio today is slightly above historical averages. And while prices have gone up, profits and earnings have also gone up significantly. So the price to earning ratio has been rising, but is only slightly above historical average. If you use the cyclically adjusted price to earning ratio, the CAPE ratio, the one that Professor Schiller has developed, the price earning ratio on a cyclically adjusted basis is meaningfully above historically averages, but it can stay above historical averages for a while and is to become even larger before the risk and the probability of a sharp correction will occur. Now, of course, in some subsectors of the US stock market, tech, biotech, social media, valuations are already excessive. And even the Fed has pointed out that those valuations probably don't make sense. And guess what? This year there was already a correction of tech stocks that was somehow significant. Now, the question is, could, first of all, a correction occur? A correction is a 10% adjustment in prices, or could a bear market occur where stock prices fall 20%? In the short run, in my view, the risk of a bear market in US equity is low, because bear markets are associated either with the beginning of a recession, that's not happening in the US, or with a very sharp tightening of monetary policy by the Fed. And the Fed is barely maybe next year start to raising interest rates from zero, and whatever happens is going to increase them only slowly. So a bear market, you need a recession or very aggressive Fed tightening. Those things are unlikely. Could you have a correction of 10% like the one we had between August and October? You cannot rule it out. If global growth disappoints, if the dollar becomes stronger, if geopolitical risks arise, even if the Fed were to start later, at some point that correction and a rise in volatility could occur. And I would not rule out that in the next 12 months such a correction could occur. Now, I expect that US equity next year are going to go up only 5% from current level because valuations are already stretched, earning growth is slowing down, and even revenue growth is slowing down. So that's a baseline of 5% increase, possibility of a correction, but not of a bear market. Now, if US stock prices keep on going higher every year for the next 2 or 3 years, in spite of earnings slowing down, price-earning ratio are going to go into a frothy and eventually a bubble territory. We're not yet there, but we're getting close. So if you had, say, next year and the following year another 10-15% increase in stock prices, then by the end of 16, you could be in a situation of a near bubble, and therefore those excesses that lead to a bubble eventually could lead to a bust and a crash or a bear market. But I think there's probability of a bubble and then a crash is a story for maybe late 2016, not a story for now, for 2015. But there is frothiness in financial market in the United States, and some of the equity market is becoming excessively overvalued. Certainly in some segments of that market there is that overvaluation.
Дорогие друзья, мы плавно приближаемся к финишу сегодняшней встречи, поэтому есть еще возможность, наверное, одного вопроса господина Рубини. Если есть желающие, то давайте не будем стесняться.
Руслан Мухамедянов. Мистер Рубини, смотрите, вот сейчас такая ситуация в Европе, то, что Германия диктует условия, хотя идея Евросоюза как единой зоны, то есть Германии предоставляются такие условия, которые не очень выгодны другим странам Евросоюза. Вот. И тут возникают такие страны, как Шотландия, которая хочет отделиться от Великобритании, Каталония, которая хочет отделиться от Испании. Есть ли возможность развала вообще Евросоюза как экономически единой зоны? Спасибо.
For now, no, I don't think that the Eurozone is going to collapse. Of course, 2 years ago, there was a risk of a Greek exit, risk of a breakup of the Eurozone, risk of Italy and Spain losing market access. Today, 2 years later, I would say that thanks to the speech by Draghi, whatever it takes, thanks to the OMT program, thanks to the ESM, thanks to the beginning of a banking union, thanks to the conventional and unconventional monetary easing by the ECB, those tail risks of the Eurozone breaking up have been reduced significantly. Think of it today, interest rates on Spanish and Italian debt and a 10-year maturity are as low, if not lower, than the United States. That's thanks to the easing the ECB has done, and more quantitative easing by the ECB in the next year is going to keep yields in the Eurozone low, spreads in the periphery low, is going to weaken the value of the euro in a way that's going to help avoiding deflation and try to improve the economic growth of the Eurozone. So in the short run, there is no risk of a breakup. Now, if you take a medium-term horizon, say not in the next 2 years, but 3 to 5 years, the fundamental problems of the Eurozone have not been resolved. Potential growth is low because you have a lack of reform. Many countries have lost competitiveness and have not regained that external competitiveness. The weaker euro is going to help, but is not sufficient. The improvement of the trade balance of many countries is cyclical rather than structural. debt to the GDP ratio of the public sector are still high and rising, and also of the private sector in some parts of the Eurozone like Spain, Portugal, and so on. So the debt dynamic is still unsustainable. Italy, public debt is 135% of GDP and rising. And Italy, unlike Greece, is too big to fail, but also too big to be saved. Greece was a 200 billion euro public debt problem. Now the Troika owns 90% of that public debt. Italy is a 2 trillion euro public debt problem, so there is no Troika program of EU, IMF, and the ECB that can bail out Italy. So if Italy doesn't do reform to restore growth and competitiveness, eventually a debt crisis in Italy in the next 3 to 5 years could occur. I'm not saying it's going to occur. And a debt crisis could even lead to the exit of some countries in the Eurozone. If one or two countries were to exit the Eurozone, then eventually the Eurozone could break up. A breakup of the Eurozone is not my baseline. I think that we still muddle through. Yes, the Germans say austerity reform, but when push comes to shove, they provide new money, directly or indirectly, by giving the green light to the ECB to do whatever it takes, including quantitative easing, to prevent the Eurozone from breaking up. So on one side, Germany is tough. When push comes to shove, Germany gives the green light, at least to ECB, even if they're not willing to do a fiscal stimulus. So for now, the Eurozone is not at the risk of a breakup, but there are economic malaise, and people are becoming restless. There is austerity and reform fatigue in the periphery of the Eurozone. In Syriza, the left-wing party might win in Greece. Podemos, the anti-Euro party in Spain, could win the next election. In Italy, Renzi fails, is back to either Berlusconi, that is a disaster, or a bigger disaster if this Grillo movement comes to power. In France, Le Pen may win the next presidential election, so you have austerity and reform fatigue in the periphery, but there is also bailout fatigue in Germany. Anti-Euro party, the new one, is getting almost 10% of the vote. So for now, the grand bargain between Germany and the periphery is holding. Germany is saying, you do austerity, you do reform, even if you do them more slowly than I find desirable. I'll be patient, I'll give you time, I'm going to give you money, the ECB is going to give you money. That political compromise has held so far, but there are increasing political fragility. If you get another 3-4 years of low growth, of high unemployment, of no job creation, eventually some populist party of the right or the left could come in power in some parts of the Eurozone. Those pressures to go alone from Catalonia or northern Italy or the Flemish in Belgium could also create a situation of some country wanting to exit the European Union or breaking up. And therefore, there are significant, of course, economic, political, and financial tail risks for the Eurozone in general, but also for the European Union. So a breakup is not my baseline, but Europe has to be more aggressive to jumpstart economic growth, to keep together Europe and the Eurozone.
Друзья, мы вынуждены этот интересный брифинг закончить. Господин Рубини, мы благодарим вас за интересную беседу.
Very interesting question, very thoughtful. I appreciated the dialogue.
Ну что ж, со своей стороны, поблагодарю и вас за сегодняшнее присутствие, действительно за интересные вопросы. Надеюсь, ответы гуру вам в чем-то помогут.